It is likely, although I've not discussed this with him since he was vice president, the vice president will look at the landscape and say the greatest threat in the nuclear landscape is not that Russia will deliberately launch a nuclear strike on the United States, or that China will do so, or that North Korea will do so. They know that's suicide. In fact, it's mutual suicide. He is informed likely by the concern that we will get into a nuclear conflict through accident and through uncontrollable escalation.
That's the voice of John Wolfsthal, director of the Nuclear Crisis Group at Global Zero. He, along with Alexandra Bell of the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation, are today's guests on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts, Michelle Dover and Tom Kalina.
Welcome back to Press the Button, and happy Thanksgiving.
From all of us here at Plowshares, we wish you an enjoyable and COVID-free holiday. Thanksgiving is going to be a little different this year for a lot of us, including me. My family will not be converging in New York City like we usually do, and I'm sure there'll be a lot more small dinners. But we hope you still get to have that special gathering, even if it's on a family Zoom.
We also want to thank all of you who attended our annual Nuclear Policy Forum last week. We had over 1,000 people tuning into the live stream to hear from guests like Senators Elizabeth Warren and Ed Markey, and Representatives Adam Smith, chair of the House Armed Services Committee, and Pramila Jayapal, who is the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. It was a really fantastic conference, and if you missed it, don't worry. We have the full video recording available on our website at plowshares.org.
Yes, please do check it out. We had a lot of great sessions and some great talks you won't want to miss. And now, getting back to our episode, Michelle, what do you have lined up for early warning?
Today, we're taking a look at two big topics. Last week's revelation that President Trump explored the idea of military or cyber strikes against Iran's nuclear program, and what we can expect from the next Congress on nuclear policy.
And after that, I bring back two of our star guests from last week's conference, Alexandra Bell, Senior Policy Director at the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation, and John Wolfsthal, who's the Director of the Nuclear Crisis Group at Global Zero. We had so many great questions at the event last week that we couldn't get to. We just had to bring them back for another round of discussion. And both Alex and John, of course, worked on nuclear policy in the Obama administration. And together, they really chart out what to look for in the upcoming Biden administration, the issues that we're likely to see happen, for example, New START in the Iran deal, and where we go beyond that. It's a great conversation and one you won't want to miss. Lastly, Michelle answers a question about what she's thankful for this year in nuclear policy. And remember, if you want your question answered on the air, tweet or DM us at PressButtonPod, or send us an email at pressthebutton@plowshares.org. We would love to hear from you.
And as always, please click the subscribe button and give us a rating. Ratings are your way of telling us what you like and what we can do better, and we rely on them to shape the show. Let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Dal. Today, I'm joined by Mary Kaszynski, Deputy Director of Policy here at Plowshares Fund. Mary, it's so good to have you back on the show.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I'm really excited. And I am the only guest today, which means I can talk as much as I want, right?
Exactly, within 7 minutes. And today we are going to talk about two things: Iran and what we can expect from the next Congress on nuclear policy. You ready for this?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Okay, so first things first. Last week, the New York Times and Wall Street Journal reported that President Trump explored the idea of a military or cyber strike against Iran in response to a recent IAEA report about Iran's increased enrichment activities. His aides warned him against taking such actions because they could escalate into a broader conflict. What should we be watching in the coming weeks?
So it's pretty clear that President Trump from the beginning doesn't care so much about preventing an Iranian nuclear weapon, but he hated the Iran deal because it was negotiated by President Obama. So things to watch for. President Trump, as he's nearing the end of his term, could get increasingly erratic. If Iran takes more steps to breach JCPOA limits, Trump could go off the deep end and respond, for example, by ordering military strikes. Now, to be really clear, that would be an absolute disaster, and that's why his aides talked him out of it. Military strikes would not solve this problem. And there's also really good reason to be optimistic that Iran would not take provocative actions. The Iranians have consistently described their strategy as maximum patience in response to Trump's maximum pressure campaign. And again, as we near the end of Trump's term, the Iranians have more reason than ever to really just wait it out until there's a new administration that's more open to returning to the JCPOA and resuming diplomacy. Definitely something to keep an eye on for the possibility of military strikes. But until then, what we really expect is the Trump administration ramping up sanctions pressure as they have been on Iran all along.
You mentioned this Iranian strategy of maximum patience. How is this translating into its response to stories like this? Or what are you seeing from other countries in the region?
So Iran's strategy since Trump withdrew from the JCPOA has been to sort of slowly and gradually breach some of those limits. They've been very careful about it. All of the steps they've taken so far are very reversible and relatively minor. And all of them are in direct response to actions that the Trump administration has taken. Again, as we approach the beginning of the Biden administration, Iran is sort of looking to build up that leverage, but very carefully avoiding crossing any red lines that would crack sort of the international consensus against the U.S. and in support of the JCPOA. So Iran's actions so far have been very, very carefully calibrated and designed to pressure the U.S. to come back into compliance.
Switching gears, looking back at the United States, Congress is in the middle of intense negotiations about the budget bill. And last week, we heard from several key members of Congress at our Nuclear Policy Forum. What were your takeaways from the event in terms of these upcoming battles in the new Congress?
That's exactly right. So these budget battles are getting very intense, and that's not going to change in the new Congress at all. So at our policy conference, we were really lucky to hear from Representative Adam Smith from Washington, the chair of the House Armed Services Committee. He is one of the main actors involved in these budget negotiations because the House Armed Services Committee oversees the annual defense bill that they're debating right now. The margins in Congress to pass that defense bill are really, really close. It's tough to pass the bill and get agreement on all of these defense policy priorities. Nuclear weapons are going to be at the heart of that debate, as they have been over the past several years, because the U.S. is slated to spend nearly $2 trillion on nuclear weapons in the coming years. And part of that is because the Trump administration wants to build new nuclear weapons, particularly an entire new arsenal of intercontinental ballistic missiles. So that fight's going to be a big one coming up. Representative Ro Khanna in the House in particular has already introduced an amendment to stop the new ICBM program from moving forward, which would save approximately $260 billion over the life of that program. It's an enormous number. Now, Congress doesn't like to cut. They like to spend and spend and spend. So the Khanna effort to cut the new ICBM, that will definitely be a big fight in the coming year.
Thanks so much, Mary. And with that, our time is up. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Michelle.
I would like to thank all of you who watched our policy forum last week on transforming national security. For those who missed it, you can find the video on the Plowshares website. It was such a rich discussion. And as always happens with these things, we did not have time to dig into the issues as much as we would have liked. So this is why today we are bringing you special bonus content. We're extending the second panel of the forum and have brought back two of our star guests. So think of this as the extended disco remix, if I'm not dating myself too much by saying that. Joining to me, we have Alexandra Bell, She's the Senior Policy Director at the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. And she served in the Obama administration as a senior advisor in the Office of the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. And we have John Wolfsthal. He's director of the Nuclear Crisis Group at Global Zero. And he was special assistant to President Obama for National Security Affairs and senior director at the National Security Council for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. Okay, so we have all of the details out there. Welcome back to both of you. Again, thank you for being on the show. For this discussion, I'd like to focus on what you see as the highest nuclear policy priorities for a Biden administration. And then we want to go beyond that and talk about how they might get implemented as policy. So I'm going to propose that we focus on 4 areas. The extension of New START, reviving the Iran nuclear deal, enacting a no first use, sole purpose policy, and scaling back the modernization program. And then I want to dive into each one of those in turn and talk about the timing and what a Biden administration might have to do to get those things done. Sound good?
Sure. In 20 minutes or less.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's go. Let's start with New START, because I think this is the thing that's going to happen soonest out of the gate. Alex, do you want to kick us off on why that's so and what a Biden administration would have to do?
Sure. Thanks, Tom. So the New START agreement, which is the last legally binding bilateral verifiable treaty between the United States and Russia, really the last guardrail against a potential arms race between the 2 largest nuclear armed states in the world, that's going to expire on the 5th of February, 2021. By design, it was 10 years in length. It can be extended for up to 5 years through a simple agreement between the presidents. So a diplomatic note between President Putin and it could be President Trump. He could do this today if he wanted to. I'm not sure he actually has anything else on his schedule. So it could be a possibility. But most likely it's looking like this will be up to President-elect Biden. He'll have 16 days with which to get this done. And it's so important because we need the predictability, the stability that the treaty provides. Our military wants that. Our intelligence community wants that. Our allies want that. So it's really going to be the top priority. It'll be necessary for the president-elect to designate probably a sort of lead for this, former ambassador, for example, and to go and sort of put the pieces in place here. And then the next longer process will be continuing on a follow-on agreement on how to get our arms around more systems, go for further reductions, improve our verification capabilities, and ignore the people who may or may not have served in the Trump administration, who are demanding things like this freeze concept that they've been talking about. They've never fully fleshed out what they actually mean by it. If they go around talking to the press saying that the next administration is doing something wrong by not getting it, that should be ignored. The priority should be New START extension, and then we can start talking about the rest of this and stop putting these sort of obstacles in the way of protecting the American people.
So just to get this straight, so the Biden administration comes in, they've got 16 days. In your thoughts, they would name a lead negotiator who would then get to work with the Russians to figure this out. How complicated or simple is that? John, you want to give us your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks also for having me. And it's always nice to be with Alex as well as with Tom. So I don't know the process by which, the Biden incoming team will set this up. They could ask for an outside special rep to come in and sort of lead this. They might also just give it to one of their senior staff. They might also just ask somebody who's already in the State Department, a career civil servant, high up, to sort of lead this, because the format for extending the treaty is actually pretty straightforward. It's included in the text of the treaty. We have executive agreements with other countries all the time. It's not that complicated. I think the challenge will be deciding whether or not the administration coming in wants to have a 5-year extension or whether they want to do something less than that. And there's been some debate about whether extending for 5 years might somehow reduce the ability of the United States to convince Russia to engage in serious talks during the Biden administration's first term. I don't know how that will sort of get weighed and judged in the Biden administration. Quite frankly, I don't think they've gotten very far along those lines yet. But clearly, they recognize that extending New START is very strongly in the American interest, that setting conditions and putting conditions on that extension makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. They know very well that unlike what the Trump administration has put forward, the Trump administration was not anywhere close to an agreement with the Russians on anything new or different or invasive or beneficial. But what I do know is that I think the Biden administration will look at New START as the first step of achieving a broader set of goals, ending the burgeoning arms race, reducing the threat of nuclear war and nuclear escalation between ourselves and Russia, and trying to put some strategy behind American nuclear policy, which is something we quite frankly have not had since the end of the Obama administration.
All right. Then why don't we move on to the Iran nuclear deal? This is another major thing that the Biden administration has said it will fix based on the mistakes made by the Trump administration after pulling out of a deal that, as we all know, was working. There'll be a little bit more time with this, months, not days. But John, why don't you lead us off on how you see a Biden administration going after reviving the Iran deal and what it would need to do?
Sure. Well, I always start with what the candidate has said on the trail and what I think he is likely to support given his record in the Obama administration. What he has said is that the United States is prepared to rejoin the JCPOA if Iran returns to the JCPOA. Both states are now out of compliance with their obligations, the United States having withdrawn, Iran having stayed in the deal, but still not complying with the terms of the nuclear obligations. And so it's a bit of a diplomatic dance that has to happen here. But in the end, if the United States and Iran both want the JCPOA to work, both have pathways to get back into the deal. Iran can reverse its nuclear steps. It can come back within the limits for enrichment, number of centrifuges, amount of nuclear material, amount of heavy water, all of that can happen. It'll take some time, several months at least. And the United States can reverse the sanctions that the Trump administration has unilaterally imposed on Iran and on third parties. And that will also take some time. But I think the real question will be political. President-elect Biden recognizes that there are political headwinds to returning to the JCPOA, even after we have seen what a just disaster unilateral withdrawal has been, how we've been isolated from our allies, how we have less leverage over Iran, and how our credibility has sunk to perhaps a new low. And he recognizes at the same time that returning to the JCPOA will create some of the same antibodies that the original deal created in groups like AIPAC and some of the political opposition and clearly in the Republican Party. So, there will be a political process here in the United States, just as there will be a political process in Iran, who has an election looming in June. And so that's why I always begin with the question of if both sides have the political will to get back in. I think it's possible, but I don't think we take anything for granted. And it's going to be a very hard slog to try to return to the status quo ante.
Alex, additional thoughts?
This is going to be a really complicated process. On the plus side, President-elect Biden understands for all of the time he's worked on this, the experience he brings to bear, he understands that verifiable multilateral diplomatic agreements is the best way to deal with the proliferation threat coming from Iran, and really the only way. So you're going to have someone who understands what the goal is, will have a team around him that's capable of building agreements. But, a lot of this is dependent on politics here and in Tehran, as John said. So I think the issue is also to be patient, to look for the possible moments, and also to really be able to explain to the American public and push back on some of this concept that there's a way to do this other than through hard slog diplomacy. and make it clear that there is no military solution. And I think the American public understand that. The last thing they want to do is get engaged in another on-the-ground conflict in this region. You have to start with that point. We don't want to end up in that terrible situation. So here's why we're going through this process that isn't, the ideal for everybody if they could just design a nuclear agreement from scratch. Like, that's not reality. We've got to create a win-win situation for all the parties involved, even if that means, not getting everything we want.
This is actually a point I think is worth building on to. So if you can think all the way back to 2017, when President Trump said that he wanted to improve the Iran deal, he wanted a better deal. He actually suggested to the Europeans that they should work to strengthen the JCPOA, that they should go to Iran, they should negotiate and see if they could improve the terms, indicating he was prepared to stay in the Obama-era deal if they could do so. Now, that was, we know, a lie, and he had no intention of staying in the deal. But the important thing is that both President Trump and President-elect Biden have said that they want to improve on the JCPOA. The difference is that history has now shown the only way to improve the deal is by staying in it, returning to compliance, and then working to build out. Withdrawing from the deal has brought the United States nothing. In fact, it's produced less than nothing. It's produced a negative result. And so if you want to get the Europeans and even the Russians and Chinese and other countries to do the hard work necessary to lengthen and strengthen the JCPOA, the first thing the United States and Iran have to do is return to that agreement, get it back up on its legs, and then work to make it a better deal.
Got it. So let's turn to an issue that may not be dealt with right away in a Biden administration, but is something that the president-elect has talked about, and that is sole purpose, that the sole purpose of U.S. nuclear weapons should be to deter their use by others. Some see this as closely aligned with a no first use policy. John, maybe start with you about your thoughts about the distinction between these, the similarities, and how a Biden administration might go about achieving this.
Sure. So I think it's important to keep in mind that whatever the United States does with its nuclear policy, this is not 2009, and it's not even 2016. American nuclear policy is designed to do two things. It's designed to do one thing, which is to protect America and its allies, but to do that by deterring aggression against the United States and its allies, and to reassure our allies that we are capable and willing to protect them should they face a threat. Donald Trump has done tremendous damage to American credibility with our allies and our adversaries. Russia and China doubt that Donald Trump would ever back up our allies, and seriously doubt that he would stand up in the face of aggression. And so President-elect Biden, who has spent over 40 years understanding the intricacies of nuclear policy and the importance of American alliances, is going to spend a great deal of time having to dig out from the hole that Donald Trump has left him. There's going to be a lot of work to do to reassure allies that America's back, that our word is good, that we mean what we say, and that we're both able and willing to protect them, both in Europe and in Asia, as well as in the Middle East. And so in the discussions about nuclear policy and sole purpose and changes to declaratory policy, the first, second, and third rule will be work with our allies and make sure that America's word is taken as a given. That being said, I think at least during his period as the senator and vice president, Joe Biden was very aware that nuclear weapons have limited utility. Threatening to use them in all manner of different conflicts, cyber, conventional, raises questions about the ability and the willingness of the United States to actually keep its commitment when it comes to core nuclear deterrence. If you make a lot of threats that are questionable, the threats that you actually have to make come under suspicion. And so that's led him over many years to support the idea that the sole purpose of nuclear weapons should be for nuclear deterrence, to deter and, if necessary, respond to nuclear attack. But all of that is going to be considered in the frame of alliance management And so I think you're right, Tom, to say it's not going to happen right away. Nobody thinks that the vice president or president-elect is going to lead with this issue. But it is something that he does believe, and I think will factor into the development of American nuclear policy over the next couple of years.
Alex, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think whether it's no first use or sole purpose or presidential launch authority, it's time to start going back to basic questions. We're at the 75th year of the age of nuclear weapons, and we're sort of at a crossroads here. We've been reducing risks, and numbers have been coming down for a long time, and now we seem like we're at this moment where numbers may be going back up, and we want to prevent that. So getting back to basics, is ambiguity actually a good thing? Nuclear planners have long thought that there was an advantage to being unclear about when and why the U.S. would use a nuclear weapon. Is that still the case? Was it ever the case? We're in a multipolar world that's absolutely, flooded with weaponized disinformation. Would it be better to be absolutely explicit about the circumstances under which we would think about triggering a potential all-out nuclear war? I think it's because of President Trump that we're actually having these kinds of conversations again. And Americans want to be talking about launch authority, about declaratory policy. President-elect Biden has already been clear that he supports a sole purpose doctrine, and he cannot see a circumstance under which first use makes sense. 2020 Democratic National Convention platform said Democrats believe that the sole purpose of our nuclear arsenal should be to deter and, if necessary, retaliate against a nuclear attack. So they've already kind of laid this out there. President-elect Biden has been clear on this. Our European allies know that this is going to be a subject of discussion. I think they also know, as John noted, that President-elect Biden is not going to come in with the same kind of attitude that President Trump has had towards our allies, that he's going to talk to people, he's going to listen to people, he's not going to do anything to pull the rug out from anyone. I think he's demonstrated across the course of his career that he cares about U.S. alliances. He thinks our alliances make this country stronger. And any discussion about changes to nuclear policy doctrine are going to be with that in mind.
Now, one more thing to add here as well. So, look, we've gotten used to the idea that the president sort of has a gut instinct, tweets it, and then they sort of work out a policy. That's not the way, the next administration is going to operate. They are going to go, as Alex said, back to base principles. In 2010, we wrote a nuclear posture review that said the greatest threats were nuclear terrorism and proliferation. And so we wanted to organize our nuclear policy to advance American interests in those two areas. The Trump administration decided that the most important role for nuclear weapons was going to be warfighting, to deter and coerce adversaries into doing what we wanted them to do. That's turned out not to be particularly effective when you see all of the nuclear threats that we face getting worse. I think it is likely, although I've not discussed this with him since he was vice president, the vice president will look at the landscape and say the greatest threat in the nuclear landscape is not that Russia will deliberately launch a nuclear strike on the United States, or that China will do so, or that North Korea would do so. They know that's suicide. In fact, it's mutual suicide. He is informed likely by the concern that we will get into a nuclear conflict through accident and through uncontrollable escalation. What is the risk that a small interaction between armed forces, planes bumping, ships bumping, a cyber attack at the wrong time during exercises, or some glitch might lead the two sides to think that a nuclear strike is coming? And that, I think, is where at least one aspect of how nuclear policy will be informed. And it's in that light that sole purpose actually makes a difference in reducing those risks to not only the United States, but to our allies. That's a conversation we can have with them, and that is important, but also with our adversaries. If they don't want a nuclear war and we don't want one, we both have abilities to reduce the prospects that that'll happen when we don't want it.
So last question to both of you, which is this overflowing inbox, right, that the Biden administration is going to face when it comes into office, dealing with faltering economy, coronavirus, climate change, racial injustice, all of these issues that will demand his and his administration's attention and will require boatloads of money to fix. How do you see that intersecting with the president's budget that he will have to revise and submit early next year, and particularly the Pentagon budget, and within that, the budget for nuclear modernization, which, as we know, is somewhere between $1 and $2 trillion over the next 30 years, depending on how you count it. Maybe Alex, starting with you, how do you think the administration will tackle that issue, and do you see opportunities for reducing the nuclear modernization program?
Yeah, I think you've seen folks in and around President-elect Biden already say things to this effect, that this budget, as it's currently drawn out, is not sustainable, that we can maintain deterrence for the U.S. And our allies at lower numbers of nuclear weapons. And, one of the ways to do that is make choices ourselves. Another way is to work with other countries to verifiably reduce numbers. And this is also something that is going to require the administration making this case strongly to Congress. And they will find allies on the Hill from both sides of the aisle, people who believe that we need to get spending under control and that we have priorities that could potentially be pushed aside if we maintain this bloated nuclear modernization budget. And I think there's a lot of support from the public. So it's about putting together clear arguments. It's anticipating potential fights on the Hill that sometimes have more to do with protecting money coming into certain constituencies and less to do with what's the best option for U.S. security. And to just keep moving ahead when you hit obstacles, finding it harder to get at this piece of the nuclear modernization budget, look at other places, find common cause with folks and not get, sort of thrown off if one particular plan of attack doesn't work properly. Sort of like velociraptors testing the fence for weaknesses. People like to make money, and this is a lucrative area of the defense world. So you have to make the case that it's not necessarily that we won't be spending money. We'll just be spending money differently on systems, on things that will actually keep us safe in the 21st century.
John, your thoughts?
Well, first, I'm disappointed, Alex, because you made a Jurassic Park reference, but not a Monty Python reference. So, we're going to go through 2 Plowshares events this week and not actually get one in, which is really, really disappointing. So
there's still time.
So look, the goal here is to maintain American security at the lowest level of risk. The goal is not to slash the nuclear budget, right? The budget number is not a target in and of itself. But the reality is that the United States has a growing economic challenge, and that the president-elect has talked about the need to actually invest the money necessary to get America back on its feet, both in terms of COVID response and relief and infrastructure. Right? We're still waiting for President Trump's infrastructure week. We're now, 208 weeks in. But at the same time, I'm very mindful of one horrifying memory. It is no fun. It's a lot of fun to work for the vice president and for the president. It is no fun to be yelled at by the vice president in his office in the West Wing. It's demoralizing, in fact. The only times I've ever been yelled at by the vice president is once when I helped write a speech he did not care for. And 2, when I made the mistake of, in the briefing about nuclear policy, ventured into the realm of politics. And he said, John, you may be the smartest guy who's ever worked for me, which is not true. But you don't know anything about politics. That's my job. You do your job and let me do my job. And so this whole question about how do you cut deals and, can you get rid of ICBM bases? And that's for politicians. As nuclear experts, we're the ones who can come in and say, you can have a secure, reliable, retaliatory nuclear force with a dyad, with 2 legs instead of 3. And actually, we have 5 legs. We don't have 3 legs because we also have these other means of delivery. That the ICBMs actually increase your risk because they are use them or lose them weapons. that they are dollar for dollar a very inefficient way to enhance your security. Submarines are much more survivable. Command and control and reliable communications is a much better investment. And then he will decide, and his political team will decide how you go ahead and implement that. At the same time, the larger defense budget process is going to play out. And depending on who the Secretary of Defense is, depending on who the Director of Office of Management and Budget is, and who the economists are, they will help decide whether or not we're going to maintain a $750 billion defense budget, which I think is unlikely, or whether we're going to have reductions that are modest or significant. And there's obviously a big debate inside the political process about whether you can have a 10% cut, as Senator Sanders has recommended and others are proposing, or whether it needs to be more modest, and where you spend that money. But that's going to come from a strategy. The strategy is not cut first and then decide what the strategy is. The strategy is, what do you need? Where do you need to make investments? And if you can save money from what have been called legacy programs, like ICBMs, then I think we can lay out a strategy for how to do that without compromising, and I would argue, in fact, enhancing American security.
Alex and John, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you so much. This has been a fascinating interview. I always enjoy talking to you both. I promise I will request no more interviews for at least a week. We'll let you get through Thanksgiving. And by the way, happy Thanksgiving. I hope you both get a great, if constrained, family break in terms of extended family relations. I know I certainly will. But again, thank you so much, and we'll see you again.
Great. Alex, we're going to do a joint watching of Monty Python. Is that the deal?
I think that's definitely on the level. I if only to, get it incorporated into future interviews.
I think at the very least, your dogs and my kids need to get up on the details, so we'll go from there. Tom, thanks for having us.
My name is Alyssa Kareem, and I'm the Development Associate at Plowshares Fund. I'm also a contributor to and a dedicated listener of the Press the Button podcast. I believe it is critical that millennials like myself learn and speak out about foreign policy issues. That's why in-depth and honest discussions about nuclear policy and national security, like the ones on this podcast, are so important. To help us continue our work at Plowshares Fund, and to keep the forward-moving conversations going each week with Press the Button, we rely upon the generosity of supporters and listeners like you. Whether you donate $5 or $50 to Plowshares Fund, your generosity is how we keep the world informed on the dangers of nuclear weapons. If you like what you're hearing on Press the Button and want to support the work of Plowshares Fund, please donate today. Visit plowshares.org to make a monthly or a one-time donation. Be a part of our vision of a world where nuclear weapons can never be used again. Thank you for listening.
We get letters. We get stacks and stacks of letters.
Well, Michelle, as you know, this week is Thanksgiving. So in keeping with that holiday tradition, I wanted to jump the line and ask you what you are thankful for this year in nuclear policy.
The same thing I am always thankful for, that we have another year to work on nuclear policy. This was not the year of nuclear Armageddon, and so we get to try again. But seriously, I am grateful for not just the opportunity to keep working, but the people. I'm always grateful for the people who, like yourselves, care about the issue, dedicate time, resources, brain space to making the world a better place. How about you, Tom?
Well, thanks, Michelle. And I agree with what you're thankful for. I'm thankful for those things as well. I'm particularly thankful we're not going to have another 4 years of the policy setbacks we've had over the past 4 years. And as you said, we have new opportunities to actually make progress on the issues we care so much about, whether it be the New START Treaty or the Iran nuclear deal, no first use, all the rest. I think we have some great opportunities coming up, and I'm very thankful for that.
Another week, another question. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Michelle. Happy Thanksgiving. And remember, if you'd like to get your question on the air, tweet or DM us at Press Button Pod, or send us an email at pressthebutton@plowshares.org.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil, Zach Brown, Derek Zender, and Will Lowry. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.